Hey there everyone, and welcome to Bill's Retro Gaming Show. On today's video, we are going to be talking about Arcade1up and some of the latest releases that they have come out with, and asking the question, is Arcade1up going in the right direction, or should they be looking towards the past for future releases? It's all coming up right after this. Alright everyone, thank you so much for joining me. If this is your first time on the channel, be sure to hit that subscription button. Click the notification bell if you want to be notified every time I put up a new video. Give this one a thumbs up and leave a comment below if you want to be part of the conversation. So what I'm talking about today has to do with Arcade1up and some of the latest releases that they have come out with. Now, I'm not talking about the new deluxe cabs that have come out, because those are basically just rebrands of their legacy cabs. They're re-releases of ones that they have come out in the past. I'm talking about the newest IPs that they've released over the end of last year and coming into the beginning of this year. Primarily, we're talking about NFL Blitz, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and The Fast and the Furious, which is set to come out within the next week here. Now, the point I'm trying to get at is, in looking at these games, is the fact that these are much newer arcade machines than some of their past releases. You look at Pac-Man, or and some of those Namco games that they've released in the past, Pong, Galaga, all things like that. Even looking at some of the Street Fighter games, the early Street Fighter games are late 80s, early 90s. So when you get to NFL Blitz now, but you were talking about late 90s and getting into the early 2000s. NFL Blitz came out in 1997, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 came out in 2000, and The Fast and the Furious came out in 2004, which I believe makes The Fast and the Furious the most recent arcade game that Arcade1up has put out there. But should they be putting out more recent, newer arcade machines, or should they be focused more on the past and going back to their roots with games like Pac-Man and Space Invaders? And there is still plenty to mine from the, what I would call, golden age of arcades, whether you look at games that have been mentioned like Qbert or Robotron, or even some games from Konami like Contra and things of that nature that I know a lot of people have been interested in them doing. Sega games, Afterburner. There are a lot of games that could be mined that are from the 80s era, certainly before the 90s, or at the very least into the early 90s. When you get into the late 90s, some of the things, like I said, that have come out lately, now this is where we start running into problems, and I'm wondering if maybe this is not the right direction for Arcade1up to be going in at this time. Now, if you look at some of these recent releases, what you're looking at are games that had to have compromises in order for them to be released. Now, when I say compromises, I'm not talking about licensing issues. There have been plenty of licensing issues with these games. You look at NFL Blitz, and of course the removal of late hits, which is something that they had to do to appease the NFL, or they wouldn't have gotten the NFL's blessing on it. You look at missing players, but again, that game has like 90% of the players, which I think is actually pretty astounding. That's not what I'm talking about. Even with Fast and the Furious, I'm not talking about missing cars or things of that nature, because again, you're down to licensing things. Those are things that you have to take out in order to get the license to make the game in the first place. I'm talking about compromises in terms of programming, in terms of coding. When you look at NFL Blitz, you've had people complain about latency. You've had people complain about slowdown and screen tears. You look at Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and while I think the gameplay is pretty great, again, you've had people who are really big in the fighting communities talk about latency issues. You look at the online issues with these games. NFL Blitz took a while to come out. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 took even longer, and a lot of people would say that's still broken and not working as well as it could be. Now, one of the things I'll say about that is, when it comes to Wi-Fi, there are some different ways that you can do this, and what most people know about, one of the ways that Arcade1up likes to do this is with something called rollback, which I'm not going to get into all the particulars of it, but I will say this, is that they could not use rollback for Marvel vs. Capcom 2 because the chipset that they're running this on couldn't handle doing rollback and playing the game at a decent rate. Let me say that again. The PCB, the control chip that they're currently using, could not handle doing both rollback and playing the game at any kind of way that would make the game fun. It would have tons of slowdown in it. It would have even more latency than it has, things of that nature. So they had to go a different route, and that's why you're seeing some of the issues with the Wi-Fi capability for that game. Now, they did include rollback for some of the other games that are on there because those games are less CPU intensive, so they could do it, and those games play fantastic. Even Marvel vs. Capcom 2, in my opinion, does play great for the most part, but my point is that you run into these issues based on the chipset that you're using. And now we fast forward to Fast and the Furious, which is coming out, and we notice things like, even though Raw Thrills, the makers of the games, are heavily involved in porting it over to Arcade1up, you do notice compromises they've made in terms of the fact that it runs at 30 frames per second instead of the 60 frames per second that the arcade ran in. People have noticed from video and screenshots that have come out that the crowds at the start of the games are either not there or less populated than they were in the arcade game, and other things of that nature. There's other stuff too involved in this that I'm not going to go into, but let's just say that Raw Thrills had to make some serious compromises in order to get this game to the state where it is to get it out. So that begs the question, is this the right move for Arcade1up? Should they be so focused on newer arcade machines and bringing those out to market? Or should they maybe go back and, again, like I said in the beginning, look at their roots? When they came out with some of their early games like Space Invaders, like Pac-Man, like, Frogger and things of that nature. Star Wars. They just re-released Star Wars, and that's a great game, and it plays fantastically on the Arcade1up hardware. Now, let me say this really quick. Obviously, just coming out of a pandemic and things, chip makers, chipsets, things of that nature, they were very hard to get. So Arcade1up probably had to, continue using things that they had used in the past. There are newer chipsets out there that are stronger processors that are probably capable of playing some of these newer games at closer to the arcade than what is currently being used now. So it is very possible that in the future, Arcade1up could be using better PCBs and better chipsets that are able to play these newer games a lot closer to the arcade, which again begs the question, is now the right time to be doing this, or should they maybe have waited a year to bring some of these out when they could use a better chipset and emulate it better and not have some of the compromises that we're seeing now? So having said that, just sticking with what they're doing now, maybe they should take a step back. Okay, we've heard, like I said, we've heard about Qbert and Robotron and a lot of these games that I know a lot of people have loved. I've been talking for a while about loving the idea of a Konami legacy cab to come out with Contra as perhaps the marquee title on it. But, there's certainly plenty of games to be mined from that era, from that 80s era, that I think Arcade1up could emulate well, wouldn't have a lot of the issues that they're seeing with some of these newer games. And I think people would really love them and really enjoy them. But, I just wanted to throw this out there and see what you guys think. Do you think Arcade1up is doing the right thing by focusing on newer arcade titles that maybe they have to compromise a little bit so that they can get them out and aren't going to play exactly as you remember them in the arcade? Or should they take a step back and maybe start thinking more about games from the past that could be emulated better, that people remember and have nostalgia for and would love to actually see come out on their systems? But let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think? Is this the right direction for Arcade1up, or should they be looking at more 80s titles? Now, supposedly there is at least one newer IP 80s title that they are working out on for either later this year or early next year. We still don't know exactly how many cabinets they plan on releasing for this year, so we'll have to wait and see what they plan to do. But personally, I would love to see them focus more on some of those older games and maybe wait on some of these newer games until they can get better PCBs that can handle them better. Those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear yours. Let me know in the comments. That's going to do it for this one, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Have a great day.